Welcome, and thank you for being here. We're very grateful to you for joining us tonight and for being part of our community. My name is Elric Walker. I'm a board member of the Jung Association of Western Mass. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Jung Association of Western Massachusetts. We are a mostly volunteer organization founded in 1996, concerned with promoting and exploring in community with others the ideas of the great depth psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce you to our board members and to the members of our advisory board, and to thank them for all their good work on behalf of the association. Christine Olson is our president. Penelope Tarasuk and Erica Lorenz are current board members and advisors, and two of the longest serving members on the board. Erica served previously as our president. Both are authors and practicing Jungian analysts. I'd mentioned that Penelope's book, Polishing the Bones, is available. Erica is about to release her book, Body as Shadow, Jung's Method of Embodied Healing, and that should be available in February of 2026. I'm sure there'll be announcements on our website about that. Peter O'Brien is our speaker liaison. Janine Cooper is our treasurer and bookkeeper. Daniel Kinsey is our newest board member and is assisting with coordinating our local events. I serve as public relations liaison and promotional coordinator for the association. We're also grateful to the members of our advisory board. Author, poet, and depth psychotherapist Dr. Ed Tick, who previously served on our board of directors. Ed Tick's book, Passage to Poros, is now available. Also, Ed will be featured, his documentary, Healing a Soldier's Heart, will premiere on PBS and will be broadcast on November the 9th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that will be followed by an interview on PBS with Ed. So if you'd look in the chat room, you can pick up the links to those premieres. Also, psychologist and therapist Dr. Carol Beauvais, who previously served on our board of directors, is now an advisor. Retired family therapist and historian Peter Williams, who also previously served on our board of directors. And Joe Cooland, who was the former publisher of Parabola magazine and who has recently become a children's book author. So we thank them all for their many ongoing contributions and for their much sought after sage wisdom. Many kind thanks to Jonathan Capra, who is our webmaster, and to Andrew Grant, who is providing Zoom and technical assistance tonight. Thank you, Andrew. Upcoming, next Sunday, November the 16th, we will continue our local film and discussion series. This next one will be at 4 p.m., and it will be at the Smith College Student Center, which is right on Route 9, and will be in room 102. If you're local and you've not been to one of these events, please come. We will show a short Jung-related film and then open up for discussion. The discussion part is often the best part. We get to come together in person to share ideas and information. It's always soulful and encouraging. Our next film will be Monica Wickman, What is the Collective Unconscious? We often meet for dinner after that event to continue our informal discussion and to get to know each other a little bit, so you're welcome to join us as well for dinner afterwards. Our next online lecture will be Friday, December 5th, 7 o'clock. Mary Antonia Wood will speak on the artist, the alchemist, the activist, archetypal transformers of psyche, matter, and reality. That will be December 5th, Friday at 7 o'clock. Please check our website for more information on these or any other of our upcoming events. You will also find in the archives section of the website videos of past lectures and events. The website is found at westmassjung.org. After tonight's lecture, we will continue for about 20 minutes for a discussion. If folks feel like they want to continue a little bit longer, we'll stick around for about 20 minutes and you can join us for that if you like. And just to let you know, our speaker does not always join us for that, but any folks that are interested can join us for that. And now I'm going to pass it over to our board member, Peter O'Brien, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Elric. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome Becca Tarnas to you all tonight. I first learned about Becca's work listening to This Jungian Life, where she explored the parallels between Tolkien and Jung and was completely fascinated by it and was thrilled that she accepted our invitation to present tonight. Becca is an assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She received her doctorate from CHS with her dissertation titled The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of C.G. Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. Her research interests include depth psychology, archetypal studies, literature, philosophy, and the ecological imagination. Becca is an editor of Archetypes, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and author of the book Journey to the Imaginal Realm, a reader's guide to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. She's currently researching and writing a biography of Stanislav Grof, one of the co-founders of transpersonal psychology. She lives in the Sierra Nevada foothills with her husband, son, mother, and their little cat, Faith. Welcome, Becca. We're really excited, and I can't wait to get going, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction and for contacting me after you heard me on This Jungian Life. And likewise, thank you to everyone who's part of this Jung Society, and Elric for your opening, Andrew for running all the tech. I know how much that, just how much work and energy that portion of putting on an event takes. So my deepest thanks to each one of you, as well as to all of you who've taken some time out of your Friday evening to talk about Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. So I'm going to be speaking for probably a little over an hour, and leave plenty of time. As Elric was saying, the discussion is often the best part. So plenty of time for us to be in dialogue with each other, for you to ask questions, share comments, insights, experiences, to kind of balance out the presentational portion at the beginning. So as we're starting off, I would love to ask those of you who have your cameras on, and I can invite others to turn them on if they want, just for this moment. It is always nice to see everyone's faces. How many of you have read Jung's Red Book? Like actually read it? Wonderful. And how many of you have, you've maybe not read it, but you've explored the beautiful paintings and images? I know it's a really wonderful way to enter into that world. Now, how many of you have read J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings? Fantastic. It always helps me to get a sense for who's on the journey with me tonight. How about The Hobbit? All right. How about The Silmarillion? Oh, wow. Okay. Unfinished Tales? History of Elric, I'm impressed. How many of you have seen Peter Jackson's film renditions that came out, hard to believe, 2.5 decades ago? Okay, so that gives me a good sense of who's here and what you've explored. So what I'm going to be offering tonight is the research that I did for my doctoral dissertation, and I'm now in the process of bringing this forward as a book. So hopefully that will be coming out maybe in the next year or so. And I'm going to be sharing images throughout. I'm going to move back and forth between sharing my screen so you can see some of these images, taking that down at times so that that doesn't dominate the whole time, but you'll also be able to experience these beautiful images. So allow me to share my screen. And we're going to start off by bringing to the fore Jung's Red Book. His Red Book is filled with dialogue, with conversations that were held between Jung and his soul. And in a passage near the beginning of the book, the following exchange takes place. So the figure of Jung in the Red Book says, "I indignantly answered, 'Do you call light what we men call the worst darkness? Do you call day night?' To this, my soul spoke a word that roused my anger. 'My light is not of this world.' I cried, 'I know of no other world.' The soul answered, 'Should it not exist, because you know nothing of it?' So I ask, should this other world not exist because we know nothing of it? Or rather, should it not exist because the scientific materialist paradigm claims to know nothing of it? So tonight, I want to speak about this other world through the lens of a synchronicity between two red books that were each crafted in the first half of the 20th century. So first, let's speak about Jung's Red Book. In his late 30s, the depth psychologist Carl Gustav Jung began to have these profound visionary experiences, these powerful fantasies, expressions of what he would come to call active imagination. And he inscribed these visions in a large book that was written in black and red letters. It was accompanied by rich illustrations. It was bound by two covers of red leather. And he called the book Liber Novus, or the New Book, but it's better known simply as the Red Book. So now let me introduce J.R.R. Tolkien's The Red Book of Westmarch. So Tolkien set out to write a mythology, a body of legends, myths, and romantic tales that would be linked in a majestic whole. So this mythology eventually took the form of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, the many stories of the Silmarillion, but within the world of the mythology itself, these tales have been written out in a book that's been passed on from generation to generation. And it's a large book that's inscribed in black and red letters. It's accompanied by rich illustrations, and it's bound by two covers of red leather. So Tolkien presents himself simply as the translator of this work, and this book is known as the Red Book of Westmarch. So at first glance, the parallel names of Jung's and Tolkien's Red Books kind of just seems to be an odd coincidence. The books couldn't actually share anything in common. So on the one hand, we have Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology. He's an explorer of the unconscious, of the archetypal realm, of the phenomenon of synchronicity. He's a Swiss man born in 1875. And then on the other hand, we have Tolkien, who is firmly English. He's a philologist and a medievalist, eventually the famous author of The Lord of the Rings, one of the founders of the genre of fantasy literature. He's a somewhat younger man born in 1892. So at first glance, there seems to be little common ground between the two men, let alone between their work, except maybe a fondness for smoking pipes. So I came to Jung's Red Book already with a strong background in Tolkien studies. And I had been an avid explorer of Middle Earth since age 9. And when I first encountered Jung's Red Book, I felt like I was looking through a book from Tolkien's world. The style of calligraphy, the ornamented letters, even the illustrations, they felt similar. So a certain resonance seemed to exist between the two bodies of work, a convergence of images, a synchronicity in Jung's terminology, but a synchronicity of imagination. So the first parallel that stood out, as should be the case with a synchronicity, was one of timing. So Carl Jung began his Red Book period, so the time of his psychological descent when the fantasy images came to him in waking life. That began in 1913. And at the same time, J.R.R. Tolkien began making an unusual series of illustrations in a sketchbook that he called the Book of Ishness. So virtually simultaneously, both men took an unusual turn in their lives. They turned away from the outer images, the world of common day, to use Wordsworth's phrase, and they focused instead upon the inner images of the imagination. So Jung's Red Book period is considered to have spanned the years 1913 to 1930, but the primary content of his visions, at least those included in Liber Novus rather than the Black Books as a whole, they came to him from late 1913 through around 1917. Then most of the sketches in Tolkien's Book of Ishness, they were done over a shorter period of time. So this is from December of 1911 through the summer of 1913. He made what he called his earliest Ishnesses, these first imaginal drawings. But Tolkien continued to add illustrations to the Book of Ishness up until 1928, so almost the exact same years as Jung's Red Book period. So although the primary creative periods for both Jung and Tolkien were during these potent years of the 1910s, they each spent the next 4 decades developing the material that they encountered during this time. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. And so I want to share with you what Jung said of this particular period in his life. He said, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work." So alongside these visionary drawings in Tolkien's Book of Ishness, another form of creativity was emerging through Tolkien as well. And these were the arts of language. So Tolkien was trying his hand at writing poetry and prose, not only in English, but in languages of his own invention, elvish languages. Mae govannen melonin, ellen sila lumen nomenti elvo. Later in his life, Tolkien became a great linguist. He was a philologist by profession. Philology means literally the love of language. And Tolkien's mother had instilled in him this love of languages. She taught him Latin, German, and French at an early age, but Tolkien actually went on to learn a total of 19 languages, many of them no longer spoken. Languages such as Gothic, Old Icelandic, Anglo-Saxon. And his close friend C.S. Lewis, who you might know from his books, The Chronicles of Narnia, or his novel Till We Have Faces, or his Christian apologetics. C.S. Lewis once said of Tolkien, he had been inside language. He'd been inside language. And when he was a child, Tolkien began inventing his own languages. He called this lifelong passion his secret vice. And Tolkien really wished to compose languages as others composed symphonies. So The Lord of the Rings, it contains quotes and passages from 14 of Tolkien's invented languages. The languages with such names as Sindarin and Quenya and Rohirric and Westron. So he knew 19 languages of this world. He then went on to invent, to create another 14. So Tolkien and Jung both had a profound relationship to dreams, imagination, myth, the world of images, for both of them starting right in childhood. Jung was receiving powerful dreams from a remarkably young age, and the significance of his dreams and visions, they occupied him for the rest of his life. And then likewise, Tolkien could recall certain dreams haunting him for as long as he could remember. Tolkien actually described himself as a young man with too much imagination. So there are these deeper, more fundamental parallels between the two men. So Carl Jung focused his life's work on mythic and religious imagery, on the symbolic significance of dreams, the archetypal patterning of the psyche and the collective unconscious. And then meanwhile, Tolkien's narrative writings, they're rich with enchantment and symbolic meaning. Dreams and visions, they also play a central role in his Middle-earth stories. Many of them are precognitive and prophetic. So Jung and Tolkien, they share this connection to a realm beyond the contemporary material world. They both knew that there was a greater depth to the cosmos than the modern disenchanted perspective allowed within its rationalist purview. And Jung felt a connection to this eternal world, the realm that he called God's world, beginning in early childhood. And this world for Jung was, in his own words, he said, it was an eternity where everything is already born and everything has already died. Now, Tolkien, he found the entrance to this eternal realm through the imagination, and particularly through fairy story. So Tolkien said, such stories, they open a door on other time. And if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time, time with a capital T, outside time itself, maybe. That's Tolkien. And Tolkien would eventually come to call this realm Faerie. Now, for Jung, God's world seems to have opened the door to the collective unconscious. And both Tolkien's and Jung's life work seeks to build a bridge between this numinous realm of symbolic imagination and the outer mundane world of their daily lives. But what is especially remarkable is that it seems not only could both men enter this other world, but they seem to have the ability to guide others into that mysterious realm as well. So now to the visions themselves. One of the earliest visions that came to both Jung and Tolkien was of major significance to each of them, and it was of an overpowering flood. Now, Tolkien sometimes called it the Great Wave. So the first of Jung's flood visions came to him while on a train journey. This was in October of 1913. And this is how Jung described it. He said, it happened in October of the year 1913, as I was leaving alone for a journey, that during the day I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. It reached from England up to Russia, and from the coast of the North Sea right up to the Alps. I saw yellow waves, swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands. Then 2 weeks later, Jung had the vision again. And this time, it was accompanied by a voice that was saying, look at it. And it is completely real and it will come to pass. You cannot doubt this. So remarkably, an uncannily similar vision came repeatedly to J.R.R. Tolkien in dreams and while awake. And he called it his Atlantis haunting. So here's how Tolkien described the dream. Tolkien said, this legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I wake gasping out of deep water. So Tolkien wrote of the Great Wave again and again throughout his life. And in each telling, the wave destroys a great civilization. A vast abyss opens in the sea and it swallows an inhabited island in all its glory. So when World War I broke out in August 1914, Carl Jung recognized that his vision of the destructive flood, that it was prophetic of the war, that his interior images were in part reflective of the external political and cultural situation in Europe. And when the war was unleashed, Jung realized that he wasn't going mad as he was afraid he might be. Rather, his internal experience was mirroring the madness unfolding in the external world. Now, Tolkien fought in that same war, and needless to say, the war had a tremendous effect on Tolkien. In the Battle of the Somme in 1916, two of his closest friends were killed, and everything Tolkien wrote afterwards carries the mark, the shadow of the Great War. So after the flood vision, in October of 1913, Jung began to engage with what he eventually came to call active imagination. And so for those who might be unfamiliar with it, in this practice, you hold in your awareness an image from a dream or a vision, or you bring forward an emotion until an image arises, and then you can eventually come into an active relationship with it. You can dialogue with the figures who emerge. You can enter into the drama itself. So Jung started to engage with active imagination in November 1913, so just a few weeks after the flood visions. And he was calling to his soul night after night. He's wandering in the desert of the imagination. He's unable yet to see with imaginal eyes. And it wasn't until December 12th, 1913, that it seems he finally had a true breakthrough with the practice. And he entered into a fully immersive visionary experience. So this vision, it marks the beginning of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. And I'm going to share some of the key elements of this initiatory experience in Jung's own words. He said, "I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears. Then I let myself drop. Suddenly, it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into dark depths. After a while, my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, which was rather like a deep twilight. Before me was the entrance to a dark cave, in which stood a dwarf with a leathery skin, as if he were mummified. I squeezed past him through the narrow entrance and waded knee-deep through icy water to the other end of the cave, where on a projecting rock I saw a glowing red crystal. I grasped the stone, lifted it, and discovered a hollow underneath. At first I could make out nothing, but then I saw that there was running water, a gigantic black scarab, and then a red newborn sun rising up out of the depths of the water." Now, this is just part of the vision, and the vision contains many symbolic images. But for this particular study, I want to draw our attention to the numerous parallel images in J.R.R. Tolkien's works of the many underworld, underground journeys that take place in Middle-earth. So the dark journey through the lost dwarf realm Moria, where Gandalf is lost in a battle with shadow and flame. Or Frodo and Sam's fearful passage through the midnight tunnel of the monstrous spider Shelob, who resembles the giant scarab Jung describes. Or Aragorn and the Grey Company's journey through the paths of the dead, where they encounter a host of the dead, a parallel to Jung's engagement with the host of the dead deeper into the Red Book. Or we have Bilbo's encounter with the dragon Smaug in the dark halls of Erebor, the lonely mountain. And we have Bilbo's fateful encounter with the twisted creature Gollum, whose lair is deep within a mountain cavern upon a little island rock set within the icy waters of a subterranean lake. And upon that rock, like the red crystal of Jung's vision, lay long hid the One Ring, the ring of power made by the Dark Lord Sauron. So in both Red Books, the heart of the narrative begins here, upon this projecting rock surrounded by cold waters, where a lost treasure of unknown power is hid, waiting for a new hand to grasp it. So as Carl Jung was having these early fantasies, the young Tolkien was creating his visionary drawings in the Book of Ishnis. And two particularly stand out in correlation to Jung's underground vision. So let me bring those images back up here. So this first one is titled simply Before. And you can see that here. You can see this dark, oppressive entryway that pulls your gaze toward the mysterious red glow at the end of the passage. And the particular shape of this imposing doorway appears again and again in Tolkien's later writings and artwork, usually accompanied by descriptions of foreboding, fear, and the unknown. So it's a doorway underground. It's a doorway to the underworld. And then the second sketch was made directly after Before. You can see this solitary figure who's walking out of a doorway of the same shape as in the previous drawing. And this image is titled Afterwards. So the coloring greatly contrasts with the stark red and black of Before, but this also, I think, conveys a sense of darkness and gloom. Yet I find it's somewhat less foreboding than the previous drawing. Now, together, these two images appear to symbolize a crossing of a threshold, entering an underworld imaginal realm. Now, perhaps the most striking of all the Ishnises is this one, which is titled End of the World. So you can see here a small figure stepping off a cliff by the sea. The sun is beaming brightly down onto the scene. White stars shine within the water itself. The crescent moon, it bends across the horizon. And yes, the image of a man stepping off a cliff and the title End of the World, they seem somber, even depressing. But perhaps they convey a dual meaning, that this is not only the end of the world, referring to its demise or the death of this man, but it's the end of the world, as in it's the end of the known world. He's reached the edge and he wants to continue his journey. So one could see End of the World as a symbol of the threshold that Tolkien crossed at this time, this doorway to the imaginal, into what he called the realm of Faerie. It also resembles the Fool card in the Tarot. So here are a few more images from Tolkien's Book of Ishnis, just to give you a fuller sense of his visions. So this is Eeriness, which depicts a kind of wizard-like figure with a cloak and staff walking down a lonely road. It seems to be surrounded by a white light. In the distance on the left, that could be an exploding volcano. It's hard to tell. This one is called Wickedness. We see the same spiralic columns as in Before, the same kind of coloring too, red and black. You can see this very eerie five-fingered hand with long nails, no thumb, just five fingers pulling the curtain ominously back. The three-horned skull at the top. And then notice that floor pattern, that checkered floor pattern. That's something that you see in alchemical imagery, and it's a patterning we'll come back to later on as well. This one is entitled Under 10-ishness. And it's paired with one that I haven't included here called Grown Up-ishness. So what it's like to be grown up versus under 10. And this one also has kind of a variation on the checkered patterning. And it too draws the gaze forward, like a pathway forward into something. In this case, into the woods, into a forest, which is in many fairy stories where the entrance to Faerie is said to be, whether that's in a dark wood or in a cave underground. But also, this is a dual image. Not only is it a forest pathway drawing our gaze forward, it's shaped like a butterfly. And interestingly, the oldest translation for, the oldest meaning for the word Psyche in Greek, psyche, is butterfly. And so while this may not necessarily have been Tolkien's intention, what we see here is a pathway into the butterfly, into the forest of psyche, of Psyche. Here's another one of Tolkien's ishnesses. This one is called Beyond. And you can see again a pathway going into the distance. If you look very, very closely, it reaches a doorway of the same shape in before and afterwards. At the front, we have these little mushroom-like trees that could have some cryptic meaning to them, or just some lovely kind of symbolic style that he's drawn on. Now, this image is called Water, Wind, and Sand, and it's likely an early drawing of Tolkien's Great Wave Dream. And you can see how, if you look toward the bottom in the center, the figure in the image is surrounded by a cloud, as though he's both present and not present in the image, like a dreamer might be. And this is a motif that Tolkien used in other later drawings as well, to indicate both presence and absence of a figure. All right, let's return now to Jung's Red Book. So there happen to be many significant parallels between the style and content of the works of art created by Jung and Tolkien. So we have the encounter with the dragon, or the serpent, or great worm. It's repeated in both Red Books, both in the narrative and in quite a few illustrations. It's kind of segmented dragon that we see on the left from Tolkien, on the right from Jung. And these denizens of the deep are ambiguous creatures. They're symbols of good and evil, and of power and wisdom. The image on the left is from Tolkien's illustration for The Hobbit, the conversation with the dragon Smaug. And you can see there on the right, it's the figure of the Hobbit Bilbo, bowing in reverence for the great dragon. Notice he too is surrounded by a cloud, not there as a dreamer, but in this case, in the invisibility of wearing the One Ring. And then if you look to the image on the right of Jung's, it's a little harder to see here, but there's also a human-shaped figure bowing in reverence to the dragon. Very, very similar composition of the bowing humanoid figure in the right-hand corner, the red dragon coiled. Now in Jung's, we see something that looks more like a star or a mandala lighting up the center, where in Tolkien's, that bright golden color is taken up by the treasure, but shining there at the top is the Arkenstone. Again, with a very, very similar shape as in Jung's drawing, but it's further in the background, it's smaller, but a very significant part of the story nonetheless. So both Red Books take place in a rich, imaginal landscape. So we're drawn into enchanted forests where we meet Ents in Tolkien's world, and Jung transforms into a leafy tree being who speaks remarkably like Tolkien's Treebeard. We see throughout depictions of the world tree. So this is the tree of Amalian, which Tolkien would draw over and over in the Book of Ishnis. He said when he felt driven to pattern drawing. And each of those flowers symbolizes a different story that's part of the Tree of Tales. So it's kind of world tree of story. Or here, the world tree or the tree of life as depicted by Jung. Or you may have one world tree here. For Tolkien, we have two world trees. So these are the two trees of Valinor. The one on the left is Telperion, and the one on the right is Laurelin. And from the last flower and the last fruit of these two trees as they died in the earliest stories of Tolkien's mythology came forward the sun and the moon. So in both Red Books, many of these trees appear to emanate their own light. So they bear these celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, stars, and many other symbols in their branches. Now, sometimes the text in one Red Book will describe the content in the drawing from the other Red Book. So for example, Jung writes in the Red Book, I look, to the right it is dark night, to the left it is bright day. The rock separates day and night. It's Jung's writing. And then this image Tolkien painted this image to depicting day and night and this division between them to accompany his Silmarillion cycles. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is notice how the crescent moon on the right, it bends away from the sun. So it's contrary to how we see it illustrated in the primary world. In Faerie, in an imaginal realm, the moon waxes and wanes for its own reasons beyond simply reflecting the light of the sun. Now, here we have two images that are designed with remarkably similar composition. So on the left is the first illuminated letter in Jung's Red Book. And on the right is the last drawing that Tolkien ever made to illustrate his own Red Book. So both show this striated landscape, with the lower third underwater, then hills rising into the background. The sun's rays are extending dramatically. And in Jung's, there's a triple conjunction of the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn in the upper left-hand corner. And in Tolkien's, it's a little hard to see, the star Erendil, which represents Venus, glimmers faintly in the morning sky in the same location in the drawing, the upper left-hand corner. And then we can see the sun with those dramatically extended rays in the center, almost mandala-like in Tolkien's, whereas in Jung's, it's off to the right, and the longest extending ray is pointing toward the sign of Aquarius. It's situated between the sign of Pisces, pointing toward Aquarius, indicating that shift from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. So both images symbolize part of each man's cosmology, although in very different ways. So there are numerous other parallels between the two Red Books, many of which I won't be able to go into here. But Jung and Tolkien, they each wrote cosmogonic myths, so these creation stories that they composed only 3 years apart, in 1916 and 1919, respectively. So the Seven Sermons to the Dead and the Music of the Ainur, or the Ainulindale. So they also each wrote about the ending of a great age of the world, the Third Age, and they each encountered a host of the dead. So the story of Jung's Red Book in some ways comes to a culmination with Jung's discovery of drawing mandalas. And the mandalas connected his work to multiple lineages and signaled his evolution towards psychic wholeness. And when Jung sketched his first mandala in 1916, he said he was wholly unconscious of what it meant. So here we have the polished version of that first mandala. It's based on a diagram that he initially sketched, and it's titled Systema Munditotius. And it's paired with his Seven Sermons to the Dead. It's an illustration of Jung's psychocosmology. And so later, in 1918 and 1919, Jung would draw one of these circular sketches every morning. And he found that they corresponded with whatever his inner experience was at the time. And Jung borrowed the Sanskrit term mandala to describe these circular images that he found himself repeatedly drawing. So the mandala is an ancient symbol. It's often in the shape of a circle or a quadrature or a combination of both, and it represents the totality of the human being. And such symbols have emerged in multiple cultures around the world, reaching perhaps their greatest efflorescence in India. And for Jung, the mandala came to represent the journey of individuation. So this movement toward the archetype of the self. So I certainly didn't expect to find mandalas in J.R.R. Tolkien's artwork. But to my surprise, towards the end of his life, it turns out that Tolkien spent many hours drawing ornate patterns on loose sheets of paper, on the backs of envelopes, on newspapers while he was solving the crossword. And amazingly, many of these intricate emblems took a mandalic form. And he considered these circular and quadratic patterns to be elvish heraldic devices, which symbolized individual characters within his mythology. Now, of all the parallels between the two Red Books, a pair of images I found particularly striking were these. So on the left is one of Tolkien's many illustrations of the evil eye of Sauron. And on the right is an illuminated letter from one of the pages of Jung's Red Book. And one of the most profound areas in which Jung's and Tolkien's visions and their respective worldviews overlap is around the nature of evil. So they both have a deep understanding of the nature of evil. They could address its presence in the world, show the importance of confronting it on behalf of personal and collective transformation. So within The Lord of the Rings, the clearest view we're given of the Dark Lord is his great eye. And in Tolkien's words, it is an image of malice and hatred made visible, the eye of Sauron the Terrible that few could endure. Now, amazingly, Jung also has a description later on in the Red Book correlating to Tolkien's Eye of Sauron. So this is Jung's writing. He says, "Nothing is more valuable to the evil one than his eye, since only through his eye can emptiness seize gleaming fullness. Because the emptiness lacks fullness, it craves fullness and its shining power, and it drinks it in by means of its eye, which is able to grasp the beauty and unsullied radiance of fullness. It sees the most beautiful and wants to devour it in order to spoil it." So that's from Jung's Red Book. So this, I would say that this single eye that symbolizes evil is an eye that looks only outward. It doesn't look inward. It doesn't self-reflect. So the eye is symbol of evil. Oh, there's some drawing appearing on there. That's interesting. That's unexpected. The eye as symbol of evil cautions against the refusal to look deep into one's innermost self, to face the shadow within. And looking only outward, one becomes subsumed by that shadow, so blind to it from within. And indeed, both Jung and Tolkien even use that same term, shadow, to refer to this darkness that must be confronted. So turning now to another parallel, one of the most prominent individuals Carl Jung encountered in his fantasies was Philemon. And Philemon was an old man who provides guidance and wisdom and who teaches magic. And Philemon bears an uncanny resemblance to another old man who also provides wisdom and guidance and is an embodiment of magic. And this is Gandalf the Grey, the wandering wizard in Tolkien's Legendarium. And so at one level, both Philemon and Gandalf, they can be seen as expressions of the wise old man archetype identified by Jung as inherent to the human psyche. So the wise old man is an integral part of myths and folktales throughout history. The wise old man is a classic motif of the hero's journey, aiding the hero when they have need of higher guidance. So while I do want to acknowledge the primary archetype standing behind and also acting through Philemon and Gandalf, let's also explore the curious particularities shared in common between these two individual imaginal persons. So we can look at their physical appearance, the scenarios we find them in, and also the words of sage advice that they offer. I'm going to just stop sharing for a moment, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So Philemon is described in Jung's Red Book as having a white beard, and thin white hair, and a wrinkled face. And there appears to be something about this face. This is Jung's description of him. It says, his eyes are gray and old, and something in them is strange. One would like to say, alive. Now, Gandalf the Grey is described as having a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. And like Philemon, there's something alive about Gandalf's eyes. So this is Tolkien's description. He says, in his aged face, under great snowy brows, his dark eyes were set like coals that could leap suddenly into fire. So we meet Gandalf for the first time in a garden. We meet him in Bilbo Baggins' garden at Bag End. And this happens to be a somewhat disconcerting meeting for Bilbo. So he greets Gandalf cheerily enough with this open-hearted good morning. But when he learns that Gandalf is looking for someone to participate in an adventure, Bilbo's mood shifts. And with masked politeness, Bilbo attempts to persuade Gandalf to leave. So Bilbo says, "Good morning. We don't want any adventures here, thank you." And Gandalf, of course, responds, "What a lot of things you do use good morning for. Now you mean that you want to get rid of me and that it won't be good till I move off." Right, so now let's turn to Philemon. We meet Philemon for the first time in a garden as well. In this case, it's Philemon's own garden. So in Tolkien's The Hobbit, Gandalf comes to Bilbo in his garden. In Liber Novus, the figure of Jung comes to Philemon in his garden. So the encounter's reversed, but the setting is the same. Both Gandalf and Philemon appear at first to be less than what they truly are. So Gandalf is seen as a mere conjurer who makes fireworks to entertain hobbits. Gandalf tells tall tales. He sends quiet lads and lasses off on strange adventures. And then meanwhile, Philemon is seen as a pensioned magician who has retired from service and who appears to be somewhat feeble-minded and perhaps doesn't remember the meanings of the spells he uses. So the dialogue in the fantasy between Philemon and Jung, and then the dialogue in The Hobbit between Gandalf and Bilbo, they mirror each other, not so much in specific content, but rather in feeling. So both Bilbo and the figure of Jung are quite disoriented by this first exchange, and they choose to bring it to a sudden close. So Bilbo declares, "Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning." And then likewise, the figure of Jung in the fantasy says to Philemon, "Thank you, Philemon. That is enough. I feel dizzy. Goodbye." So Gandalf has many names in Tolkien's legendarium. Mithrandir among the elves, or Tharkun to the dwarves. In the south, he's known as Incanus. In the north, he is Gandalf. But Gandalf's original name in his youth was Olorin, which comes from the Elvish olor, which means dream. However, this word dream, it doesn't refer to typical human dreams, such as the dreams that come to one in sleep. The word olor is derived from the Quenya, or the High Elvish word ollos, which means vision or fantasy. So Gandalf's name Olorin refers to visionary dreams, which is especially intriguing when considered in the context of Jung's relationship to Philemon and how this figure would come to Jung through visions and dreams. So Gandalf and Philemon, they're both guides through the realm of images. So what do these parallels of the Red Books intimate? So to be clear, these are not the same books. We can learn as much from their many differences as their similarities. But this is what I take the synchronicity of the two Red Books to mean, that both men seem to have entered a different realm, an other world. Tolkien called this realm Faerie. Sometimes he called it the perilous realm. And based upon evidence in his writings, it seems Tolkien was engaging with a similar method to Jung's practice of active imagination, and perhaps also had visionary experiences that he called Faerian dramas. So Tolkien spoke of how these stories arose in his mind as given. He would say, "I always had the sense of recording what was already there somewhere, not of inventing." So the there somewhere that he's referring to is Faerie, the imaginal realm. And Tolkien describes this realm as follows. He says, "The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high. And in that land, a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered. But its very mystery and wealth make dumb the traveler who would report. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All that I can ask is that you, knowing all these things, will receive my withered leaves, as a token at least that my hand once held a little of the gold." My hand once held a little of the gold. Now, Jung makes a similar statement, a statement that mirrors symbolically what Tolkien said. So this is Jung. He said, I felt that in some time or other, I had passed through the Valley of Diamonds, but I could convince no one, not even myself, when I looked at them more closely, that the specimens I had brought back were not mere pieces of gravel. The Valley of Diamonds, the gold of Faerie, both men were describing a place they had seen, a place that could not be fully captured in language. So the question is, how does the imagination, how does active imagination give access to this realm? Again, I'll stop sharing. So in brief, I would posit that the imagination participates in the collective unconscious, giving rise to what some, such as Henri Corbin, have called the mundus imaginalis, or the imaginal realm, the world of the imagination. Again, what Tolkien called Faerie. And I would suggest that active imagination can be understood not simply as a means of accessing the unconscious in an objective sense, but rather as a form of participation in the collective unconscious. So active imagination can be understood as a form of participatory knowing, as the transpersonal scholar Jorge Ferrer calls it. So the fantasies that Jung encountered through active imagination can be seen as transpersonal, participatory events, this co-creative enaction between the human organ of the imagination and the non-determined archetypal power of the collective unconscious. And I would suggest that the faculty of the imagination participates in the archetypes of the collective unconscious, shedding light upon a realm that is eternal and objectively real, yet is also newly created, that's emerging afresh with each new visitor to its domain. So as Jung writes in the Red Book, to give birth to the ancient in a new time is creation. The task is to give birth to the old in a new time. So there's one figure who I wish to discuss, one final figure, who can be found in both Red Books. And she's one of the wisdom keepers both Jung and Tolkien had the privilege of encountering. She came to Jung as his soul. He thought she was his personal soul, and he would later come to call her the anima. But I believe, somewhat in agreement with James Hillman's personalistic fallacy, that she may be even more than this. So looking to Tolkien's Red Book, we see this figure in other forms: Galadriel, Arwen, Elbereth Gilthoniel, and most importantly, the Queen of Faerie. So I want to conclude this presentation with storytelling by sharing passages from the final tale that Tolkien ever wrote, the short story Smith of Wootton Major. And many scholars consider this story to be semi-autobiographical. Interestingly, Smith of Wootton Major was published in 1967, so very close to the end of Tolkien's life, in the magazine Red Book. So Smith of Wootton Major tells the story of a man named Smith who, as a child, received a Fae star, an emblem from the realm of Faerie. And this star, it grants him passageway into that enchanted world. And on one of his journeys through Faerie, Smith enters a high mountain meadow where he hears elven voices raised in song, and he sees a ring of maidens dancing. And one beautiful woman with flowing hair steps forward, and after exchanging a few words, she invites him to join her in the dance. So here's the encounter described in Tolkien's own words. There they danced together, and for a while he knew what it was to have the swiftness and the power and the joy to accompany her. For a while. But soon as it seemed, they halted again, and she stooped and took up a white flower from before her feet and set it in his hair. Farewell now, she said. Maybe we shall meet again, by the Queen's leave. So this flower that he's given, it never wilts nor fades. It stays as this eternal reminder of Smith's encounter with this elven maiden. And interestingly, in his own work, Carl Jung described the anima as elf-like, recognizing that she seemed only partially human. And like so many of the figures in Tolkien's mythology, the maiden who Smith encounters is also of elven kind. So the elf, the anima, who is she? And as is revealed at the climax of Smith of Wootton Major, this particular elf woman is more than she at first appears. So Smith is summoned upon a far journey into the land of Faerie. And it's a journey that's meant to be his last to this enchanted realm. And he's guided during his passage, but he has little memory of the way. And at last he finds himself in a high place beneath countless shimmering stars. And there are no words better than Tolkien's to describe this encounter. So these passages from Tolkien's final tale, they're worth presenting at length so as to convey the full poignancy and numinosity of the meeting. So Tolkien wrote, "There he was brought before the queen herself. She wore no crown and had no throne. She stood there in her majesty and her glory, and all about her was a great host shimmering and glittering like the stars above. But she was taller than the points of their great spears, and upon her head burned a white flame. She made a sign for him to approach, and trembling he stepped forward. A high, clear trumpet sounded, and behold, they were alone. He stood before her, and he did not kneel in courtesy, for he was dismayed and felt that for one so lowly, all gestures were in vain. At length he looked up and beheld her face, and her eyes bent gravely upon him. And he was troubled and amazed, for in that moment he knew her again, the fair maid of the green veil, the dancer at whose feet the flowers sprang. She smiled, seeing his memory, and drew towards him, and they spoke long together, for the most part without words, and he learned many things in her thought, some of which gave him joy, and others filled him with grief. Then he knelt, and she stooped and laid her hand on his head, and a great stillness came upon him, and he seemed to be both in the world and in Faerie, and also outside them and surveying them, so that he was at once in bereavement and in ownership and in peace. When, after a while, the stillness passed, he raised his head and stood up. The dawn was in the sky, and the stars were pale, and the queen was gone. Far off he heard the echo of a trumpet in the mountains. The high field where he stood was empty and silent. He knew that his way now led back to bereavement. So I would say that the Queen of Faerie is more than the anima or the personified soul of one individual. She is the soul of the world, the anima mundi in all her glory. She is Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. When Carl Jung and John Ronald Tolkien were each guided into the world of the imagination, I believe it was the anima mundi who granted them passageway, bestowing for a time the Fae star that would allow them each to pass back and forth between realms. So the synchronicity of the two Red Books, it indicates that Jung and Tolkien were treading parallel paths through the imaginal realm. The doorway opened to each of them at the same moment in history. They were given access to the same landscapes. They met many of the same people. And Jung advised each person to make their own Red Book from the fantasies that arise through the practice of active imagination. Return to your Red Book like you would to a sanctuary or cathedral, for your soul is within its pages. Now, Tolkien's Red Book is the Lord of the Rings, and it's a text that's treated by many as a sacred text, returned to year after year or read aloud with loved ones. Why is that? The Lord of the Rings, like Jung's Red Book, it's an invitation to enter into the imaginal realm, to journey to the back of beyond. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.G. Jung were offered a gift, an invitation that allowed each of them to cross the threshold into the world of the imagination. And there's a reason it's called the perilous realm. It's dangerous to enter this domain. and it's folly to wander its paths without a guide. If one isn't careful, madness can ensue. This is what Tolkien means when he says, lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost. The doorway can shut, and one can find oneself locked eternally in a world of symbols, without the ability to return back to the external world, or to connect again with others in the realm of consensus reality. Or one can be shut out forever, living in a world devoid of enchantment, believing life to be little more than the struggle for survival, making up meaning as a way to get through one's daily toil. So Jung and Tolkien entered the mundus imaginalis during a time in history and as part of a modern culture that didn't see the spiritual or the numinous or the imaginal as part of the natural world. They each came of age in an era of disenchantment. So the world had been scoured of its demons and angels and its elves and dwarves and dragons. The starry sky, it was merely a void. The moon and sun, only atoms and energy. Trees were only a source of wood, and high mountains only a repository of coal and metals. So where did they go? The lost beings who were no longer believable, who were no longer real, who were just imaginary, or were only a fantasy. They retreated into the imaginal world to await a time when they might be rediscovered there, seen by those who had eyes to see. So the Queen of Faerie, the Anima Mundi, extends an invitation to those who are willing to cross her threshold, to return to that realm and behold its wonders and its terrors. And she asks those who tread the pathways of her realm to give her a gift in return, the gift of remembrance. Please record your experience, whether it's in song or tale, in painting or poetry, or in the quiet memories that you share with a loved one. Believe that those experiences are real. There's a bridge between here and there, and if you've had the privilege to cross it, leave a trace so that others too may find their way. And someday, when enough people return with eyes and hearts and minds open to the mundus imaginalis, they will remember that this is our world. The two realms have only been falsely separated. The bridge walked between realms doesn't go only in one direction. And perhaps the denizens of Faerie may one day return to the natural world. Perhaps we are facilitating the return of the Queen to her full domain. So on that note, I will end. Thank you all so much for listening. And now let's open up for dialogue, questions, comments, insights, objections, whatever is coming up for you. Thank you all so much for listening.
I have a comment.
Please, yes.
So this occurred in around 1913, and it makes me think of like 1965 to 1975 and the classic rock music and the writers of that time, how there was it felt like a collective passion to create that music. So I just liken that to the synchronicity of Jung and Tolkien.
Mm.
That synchronistic time where people could create if they caught the psychic wave, I guess.
There are these moments in history where it feels like there's an acceleration of creativity or this potent access to imagination, creativity, and so forth. Jung and Tolkien weren't the only ones who were engaged in this kind of work during that period. Many of Jung's contemporaries were. The shifts in terms of artistic movements, literary movements, and so forth during that time were very, very profound and very rich. And I've just focused on these two and the parallels between them. But you're absolutely right that there are moments in history that seem to be deeply archetypally patterned in a meaningful way. Thank you. Anyone else have any comments, questions, insights? Yes, Andrew.
I'm interested in when the tribal circle was broken. And that's apparent here in the Northeast in the United States, especially where I live. But I'm wondering about when in places like Scotland, where my people were from, where people had gathered around the fire together and told stories, and there was much more connection. And part of colonization, as I understand it, is the ripping out of, away from the land, but also away from story and imagination. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And while we can say it's ended in some places, it continues in others, or is nurtured within certain cultural contexts to this day. But I think really what you're speaking about is the shift in worldview to the dawn of modernity and the slow process of disenchantment that takes place, and in some ways is initiated by the Copernican revolution, that shift from the Earth being seen and experienced as the center of the cosmos to a rational understanding of the sun as center of the solar system, that heliocentric shift. And while for the Copernicans, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, this was a deeply spiritual, numinous, religious process of understanding, of seeming kind of dawning awakening to, oh, this is God's creation, with the sun at the center. Now we fully understand. That process, nonetheless, over the centuries, leads to a disenchantment, an empowerment of the human mind, human reason in that modern context, and then a disenchantment of the objective world that then gets imposed on other cultures through, as you brought up, the process of colonization, for example, of a deeming this modern Western disenchanted secular worldview being held over and above the worldview of other cultures that it's encountering, that still can recognize that sense of meaning and purpose and souled nature of the natural world. So I think, to answer your question, on the one hand, that tribal circle, while diminished, is not lost. And on the other hand, I think that shift that you're asking about, at least in terms of modern Western culture, really comes about with that shift in worldview that it takes centuries to set in, but is initiated by the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and a few other influential factors. Does that help address your question, Andrew?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I should say that for Jung and Tolkien, at the beginning of bringing forward their works in the first half of the 20th century, both born at the end of the 19th, they're waking up in a disenchanted cosmos in terms of the collective worldview, but not experiencing it that way. And so what they articulate and illustrate and bring forward is simultaneously a recovery of something that's been lost or backgrounded, as well as a moving forward to a more, you could say, integral worldview, to use the terminology of Jean Gebser, that lets us simultaneously hold that modern objective perspective while realizing that it's also deeply participatory, and that all of meaning and purpose and souled nature is not just within the individual human being. So, yeah, thank you for that great question. All right, I see Eve and Rosemary. Your hands are up next.
Hi. Oh, did that work?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, my mother and I have been taking the Robert Moss training on dreaming for about 4 years, and so dreams have gotten more and more vivid and interactive, you know. But recently, I had a very strange thing happen where I ended up battling a demon for a night, and I didn't remember it. That the person who was with me in that night saw the whole thing happening, and me getting suffocated over and over. And by morning, I was okay. I had called in a goddess, I guess, and when I went back into the dream, I saw that, and I was okay. But the I also saw that the demon had jumped to my friend, and my friend was never the same, like completely different person towards me since then, like with absolutely no similarities to who I've known him as. And I wonder, when you look at Tolkien and um, Jung, and they're always going into these shadow realms like with great bravery. What would be the theme that you would notice for how they overcome or how they come out in the light? Because when I've seen, read some of the books or seen some of the movies, I can't even keep going with the amount of war stuff that at least the Hollywood puts in there, of endless demons that I can hardly face. One in this dream almost killed me. So, like, what would you see as or say about their way of the light of the ring, or to make it through, when dreams transfer into this world and you're really dealing with the two worlds blending and you've got to figure out a way to come back to the light?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what you're describing, not that we need to go into it, but I'm very curious in terms of your friend and the shift, if it's something he acknowledges or is aware of or recognizes, or if it's your experience in relation to him and he's kind of in denial of that. You don't have to answer it, but that's something I'm curious about. Um, the biography that I'm working on writing right now of Dr. Stanislav Grof, who's a one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, and it's very much in the lineage of Jung. But he's 94 now, but he's a Czech researcher whose work focused primarily on LSD psychotherapy, starting in the mid 1950s through the 60s and early 70s. And he had certain um, sessions, clinical sessions, with individuals that were very similar to what you're describing in terms of a kind of demonic possession state. And with a young woman even being kind of taken over by this demonic figure who introduced himself as the devil in the middle of a session, speaking with a deep male voice, unable to able to know things that this young woman, the patient, couldn't have known. Um, and he sat with her for 2 hours, holding her hand. He says the longest 2 hours of his life, meditating with just visualizing white light surrounding them. And after about 2 hours, this seeming demonic possession or kind of archetypal possession state released. And afterwards, when the woman wrote up her whole experience, she had no recollection of those 2 hours at all, which has definitely convinced me of a certain ontological reality of a certain kind of demonic presence. Um, in terms of Jung, I'll speak first in terms of not so much just engaging with these more demonic, or he has like a whole descent into hell in the Red Book, but kind of the whole experience that already was very, very challenging for him to be having these seemingly spontaneous visionary experiences that over time he starts enacting himself through the practice of active imagination. But it's still, even though he calls it my most difficult experiment, which gives it this sense of objectivity, that it was an experiment, that he was in charge. At the time, it was very clear that to those around him that he was being kind of dragged through this experience. And he said that the thing that kept him able to come back to himself was his relationships and his work. That it was reminding himself, I'm Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. I I'm seeing these patients. This is my wife. This is my family. This is Tony Wolfe, who was not only his, as he described her, kind of his left-handed marriage or spiritual wife, but she was the guide. He wasn't alone doing this. She was the guide who helped him, kind of like Ariadne with the thread with Theseus and that myth, to guide him back out again. So the importance of relationships, of being able to kind of come back out to share your experiences with others, as something that's grounding. For Tolkien, we have much less in terms of what he shares about his experiences, and it's all given to us kind of couched in fiction. It is fiction in the way that it arrives to us, but it's imaginal experience that has been artistically revised very creatively into fiction. I think that in itself can be a kind of protection of turning something into art that others can experience and appreciate. This is something that I don't agree with Jung. He disparaged those who went into the unconscious and brought it back as art. He felt like they were kind of reveling like a Dionysian bacchanalia in that realm without wanting to understand it. Jung wanted to understand what was behind the visionary experience, as opposed to turning it into art. But I think that there is a value in that artistic form, that it can protect us in some ways. And then the last thing I'll say in relation to your question, in terms of the Hollywood interpretations of Tolkien's storytelling, because these days when we encounter fantasy, whether that is in the countless books of fantasy that are now written, or the different film expressions of it, violence is very dominant there. I think that's a larger issue that we find in Hollywood. There always seems to be this battle that needs to be taking place. But when we look at Tolkien's writings as one of the founders of the genre of fantasy literature, his choice to include war in it, and it's not as in your face as it is in film depictions, but his choice to do that comes from the fact that he himself survived the First World War. He was in France, he was in the trenches. And I think for him, being able to tell these stories was one of the means of actually transmuting the trauma of that experience and those losses. So I guess what I'm kind of the various answers I'm giving are the importance of being able to share one's experiences, to turn them into story, into art, to hold them in the context of relationship, to hold them in the context of our communities, as a way to bring ourselves back, to walk that bridge there and back again. I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, so does that help answer your question?
So much. This person did go into total isolation from being in contact with me every day, many times a day, to like, I never want to talk to you again. And he had heart fibrillations for a number of days. So he felt he was being attacked by whatever had happened in the night, and that he didn't know how he would survive it, and that I was now dangerous. And so he's gone into complete isolation. He wrote saying, I never want to talk to you ever again. It was my lover. So it was really shocking. It was really strange. But I love this idea of the art being a bridge, and friendship, that if we come out of our shell of what we're going through our dreams or our visions, and we try to connect them with the help of others to this world, that's very helpful. So thank you so much. Thank you for this amazing presentation.
Thank you for your question and sharing your story. And I'm sorry that happened to you and your friend. And
Yeah.
while he has his own journey, may yours unfold in a way that you can find healing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.
Let me turn now to Dinah. Am I saying your name correctly?
Hi, yes, my name's Dana.
Dana, beautiful name.
Dana, yeah. Yes, and I just wanted to kind of address the previous question a little bit because you were mentioning art. And you said the importance of having a friend in that sort of, well, you could call it a holotropic state of mind if you're using a Stanislav Grof's vocabulary. But I'm so interested in the Monroe Institute's work on training people to try to get into sort of a active imagination, other realm, fairy sort of mindset. And they have great resources for creating just a personal protection because fear is such a huge part of that. But that was just an extra comment. What I really wanted to point out was, obviously, thank you for a great talk. Two of my most treasured heroes. Having so many synchronicities is just wonderful to see somebody talking about it. And you mentioned the mandalas and how you didn't expect Tolkien to have drawn them. And I remember having such a wonderful experience of first coming into contact with the Red Book and thinking it reminded me so much of Hildegard von Bingen, another mystic who is well versed in those holotropic states of consciousness. And definitely, I mean, what a genius of her time. And again, just timeless, ancient themes that come up again and again, I just find magnificent. But my question was actually the end where you talk about the anima mundi, asking us to make art in the sake of remembrance. That last portion of your talk was beautiful. And I was wondering, were you quoting something or was that you?
That last portion is my own writing, my own articulation of those ideas, of the return of the queen and so forth. Yeah.
I think it's beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm really glad you brought Hildegard up. I'm waiting for the person who will come and do a 2 Red Books version of Jung's Red Book and Hildegard's mystical books of visions, because there are so many parallels. The other pairing that I'm very happy to see a new book came out recently is on Jung's Red Book and Dante. Routledge just published a book. I'm forgetting who the author is, but on those parallels. So I'm so happy to see that, and kind of to complete that. I mean, I guess there's others too. We could do it with Nietzsche. We could do it with Goethe. We could do it with William Blake. But Hildegard, I think, is a really significant one. I have a talk that's terrible quality in terms of filming, but a good talk that you can find on YouTube, not looking at Jung and Hildegard, but looking at Tolkien and Hildegard and comparing their cosmogonies. So I gave it with one of my fellow faculty members from the graduate program I teach in. Thank you for bringing that up.
I'm definitely gonna have to look that up. Thank you.
It's filmed in a darkened dance dome tent at Esalen Institute, and that's what I mean by the quality. But it was a fun moment and a good talk, and has some interesting insights. Thank you, Dana. Darlene.
Hi, I'm over here a little bit in the dark, in the shade. I'm in my living room, but excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that. I really liked it was very rich, the imagery, the analysis, the comparison was just really good. I like the way you ended it, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that in regards to the return of the queen.
Yeah.
I think that, not having the feminine divine, right, was almost kind of like a disappearance of that. And I was wondering if you thought that that was part of Jung's disenchantment, right? The disappearance of the feminine divine. Was he sensing that? Because, a lot of my study or readings that I'm interested in is this point of how the first religions of the world were really feminine based, and then we became colonized, and you saw a disappearance of that. And so, do you see any correlations with that, I guess, is my question? And do you think that that's part of the manifestation of that with the dream work?
Great question. And I think that, alas, the erasure of the feminine long predates the disenchantment, the secularization of our worldview. If you look back through most of the world's major religions, uh, the they're patriarchal religions. And so, unfortunately, we have to look back much further to understand that disappearance. And that's why that has taken place, why patriarchy has been so dominant in multiple cultures and in so many of the world's religions, is a thesis beyond my ability to address here and in this context. But um, it's something that for Jung, he very much recognized as being missing. He would talk about the Trinity, the kind of triune Godhead, and that the missing fourth is the feminine. Now, he also talks about it as the missing fourth is evil, and the missing fourth is the body. And so that's always kind of an uncomfortable moment when you're like, well, okay, saying that the feminine evil and the body are missing, and are we conflating all of them? Um, but I don't think it's quite as simple or even necessarily as problematic as that might first appear, because um, there is a kind of, I have to think about this because um, it's hard to articulate this in a way that comes across from the intuition or image that's present. But if you imagine um, a creator god and a creator goddess, and um, that in the telling of the world's religions and mythologies, that maternal creator is not only backgrounded but completely erased, wouldn't in some way there be some sense of, well, I'm just going to devour the whole thing back up into my womb then? Like, isn't there some sense of that we could think of it as like the devouring mother kind of archetypal principle that's there when that isn't acknowledged or seen. Um, Oddly enough, the best illustration I've seen of this um, is, if any of you have seen the Disney film Moana, there's an amazing depiction of this, of what seems to be the kind of evil or at least demonic, frightening villain figure that's this kind of personification of a volcano, this embodiment of a volcano. And what we realize in the course of the storytelling is that she is the Mother Earth goddess who's had her heart stolen. And what happens when that's taken away is we do have that kind of return of the repressed revenge, um, devouring form, and then she's given her heart back, or this, again, this invitation of the return of the queen to come back into her full domain, that it doesn't need to be destructive. It doesn't need to be one-sided because she's being acknowledged. I don't know if that makes sense, the way I'm describing it. It's something I'm still kind of working with and haven't been able to articulate fully, in a way that I'm fully comfortable with. But um, that's the intuition I have, at
Yeah, I'm
least.
just
So,
wondering if Jung laments that, the loss of the feminine divine, and if that's part of the manifestations or part of his dreaming, or the shadows that he was working with. And is there more evidence of that? I mean, I don't know. I would love to read about that if it was.
yeah, what you might want to read is Answer to Job, which is very much connected to Jung's Red Book, and he brings up Sophia, who I also spoke about at the end um, of this presentation. Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, or that kind of the wisdom of the Godhead, you could say. And one thing that was very significant for Jung was in Catholicism, the papal bull of the Assumption of Mary, the idea that, oh, Mary also, obviously this is fully within a Christian tradition. But this idea that Mary also was assumed into heaven in bodily form in the same way that Christ was. That to Jung he saw as a very significant historical development that the Catholic Church actually was putting forward that new dogma. I think it's 1952 that happens. So he did see that as very significant and was reflecting on it, particularly later in his life. So yeah, thank you for that. Great question, Darlene.
Thank you.
Erica, please.
Thank you, Becca. That was wonderful. I didn't realize the mirroring that they did for each other. Did they know each other?
I always wait for that question to come up. They didn't know each other.
Huh.
And I think there's no point in Jung's life that he ever would have been aware of Tolkien, just because Tolkien's work, The Lord of the Rings wasn't published until the mid-1950s. It really became popular in the 1960s. Jung passed away right at the beginning of the 60s, 1961. We do know that probably in the early 1940s, Tolkien would at least have been aware of some of Jung's work. And we only know that because there's two notebook pages that just have jotted down Jung, and then Psych of Unk, which is probably Psychology of the Unconscious, which would have been the 1916 English translation of Transformations and Symbols of the Libido. It's the only place in his notes that there's any reference to Jung. But he did around that time start writing an unpublished story called The Notion Club Papers that is kind of it's a fictional retelling of, it starts off as almost like as he says, like a broken mirroring of the Inklings, which is the informal Oxford literary group that he was a part of with C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield and Charles Williams and others, that met in the 1930s and 1940s. So the Inklings, the Notion Club, the Notion Club Papers. It was an unfinished story, and he is starting to play with some ideas in these conversations around what he calls Faerian dramas or elvish dramas or waking dreams. And the language starts to get a little bit more Jungian when he describes his Atlantis haunting, that repeated great wave dream that never went away until he included it in The Lord of the Rings. And then he found out later that one of his sons, Michael, inherited the dream. And he always had this intuition that he'd maybe inherited it from his father, who passed away when he was under 4 years old. But he never knew. He couldn't confirm that with anybody. So he felt like he had this inherited dream. He was very interested in that kind of idea. And he called it his Atlantis complex. So there's some indication that he has this exposure to at least early Jung, but of course he wouldn't have known the Red Book. None of us did before 2009. And also, a lot of Jung's really great works were, it's very unlikely that Tolkien would have been reading them. He's by no means a Jungian. But my guess from everything I've explored is that he probably encountered some of Jung's ideas through his fellow Inklings, particularly most likely Owen Barfield, maybe C.S. Lewis. But also, in terms of them not being connected, all of those illustrations from the Book of Ishnis, all of the earliest stories that Tolkien was writing in what he called the Book of Lost Tales, the first 20 years of him writing about Middle Earth, there's no way he would have been aware of Jung. So it just makes it all the more interesting. Yeah.
I have the Jung quote that you did talking his journey, and it's the prima materia for the rest. Do you have the reference for that?
Yes, we can find that in a few places.
Yeah.
And that particular translation of it is actually from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It's on page 199.
Great.
Glad I got that citation in there. But there's other translations of it too. For example, right at the beginning of the Red Book, there's a slightly different translation that kind of illuminates other facets of it. So, yeah.
When Shamdasani introduced the Red Book in New York, he said this is the Rosetta Stone for the rest of his work.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And the other thing is, yeah, when you talked about Copernicus, I thought of Plato, who was there. He had his 1 foot deeply in the Western mysteries. He was deeply an adept. And then he was the father of metaphysics and logic. So here we see that beginning to pull apart and very,
Yeah.
yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you as well. Yeah, I mean, Plato stands behind all of this, who, in terms of articulating a philosophical understanding of archetypal principles, for example. I always say at the end of the day, I realize I'm a Platonist. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you, Erica. Peter, please.
Yes. Hi, Becca.
Hi.
Thank you so much. That was totally enlightening for me. And I'm wondering if you've run across anybody else who's made these connections between Tolkien and Jung. Has
Yeah.
who?
Who else has done this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so another scholar who's done this is the Gnostic scholar Lance Owens, who has a number of lectures out on Jung's Red Book. And then he also has 3 lectures on Tolkien's Book of Ishnis in particular, and his kind of understanding of this idea that Tolkien, like Jung, may have crossed a threshold into an imaginal realm. So he was one of the scholars who inspired me early on in this work. And he actually brought out his lectures on Tolkien before Jung's Red Book was even published. It was kind of in anticipation of that. Um,
Oh.
and then he's since done lectures um, on Jung's Red Book and kind of understanding that. And what's interesting is when he's discussed the two of them in relation together, and I actually about 10 years ago invited him out to the graduate school that I went to and now teach at, so he could talk more about this. He really put forward a call that someone needs to look into these parallels. And this was something I was already doing when I encountered his work. And so I kind of took that as okay, I'll go deep into the details and kind of map out all the parallels. And, this just tonight just scratched the surface in terms of the parallels. I've written about so many more of them. And even there, with a almost, it's like 350-page book, there's still so many I had to leave out. It's really quite extraordinary, all the different parallels between the two. Now, there are other scholars who have looked at Tolkien's work through a Jungian lens, which is a little bit different, like a Jungian psychological interpretation of Tolkien. And we have that. There's 2 books. The Individuated Hobbit, very clever title, came out in 1979. There's also a book that was originally published in Danish called Where the Shadows Lie. And then there's a number of articles that look into, again, not parallels. They're not looking at the Red Books, but doing that kind of Jungian analysis of Tolkien, which his work lends itself to.
Oh, well, so you've taken it obviously a step further. There's you probably know this. There's been many instances in history where there's been simultaneous discoveries,
Yes.
unbeknownst to either one of this seems like a metaphysical version of that.
Yeah, it seems to. Yeah.
Has it, if you don't mind sharing this, has this affected your dreams, or have you had dreams through this whole process that have happened to you?
So part of why I ended up even going down this path was, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I was an avid explorer of Middle Earth since age 9. And when I say that, I really do mean an explorer of Middle Earth, that from my first time encountering that world where The Hobbit was read to me, by my Waldorf teacher in fourth grade. And then a few years later, I read The Lord of the Rings myself. I started having this experience that it was simultaneously subtle and totally overwhelmingly encompassing of like a dual reality. Yes, I was a teenager going to high school and living my everyday teenage life. And there was a part of me that was wandering under the starlight in the, uh, beautiful sylvan paths of Middle Earth. And I never could quite get out of it. And I could never really explain that to anybody either. Because again, it was subtle enough that it was just kind of an innate part of my reality, but meaningful, kind of spiritually meaningful enough as well that I couldn't let it go. And I couldn't understand what this was in relation to, well, just another story. But I did try and set it aside right around the time that I moved across the country to not too far from where you all are and went to Mount Holyoke College for my undergrad. And I thought, okay, let's do this modern mind thing. Didn't use that language at the time, but really kind of tried to set that aside. And it was only when I came to graduate school and one of my professors had us read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories that I thought, first of all, you can study Tolkien in graduate school. That's very interesting. And secondly, I realized there's this whole philosophy of imagination, of understand that there's an epistemology to understanding exactly these kinds of experiences that may be more encompassing and potent and kind of pulling one in the way that Jung experienced and others have had, or that may be more subtle and not as disruptive, but still deeply, deeply meaningful. So it started off with personal experience. And along the way through my research, definitely my dreams were very potent through that time. And it was, all through those years of doing the research, I was kind of, it felt like living in multiple realities at once. But, I'd wake up, I'd go to sleep and be in the dream world, and then I'd wake up and be kind of moving through Jung's and Tolkien's worlds at the same time.
Wow.
So
Last question. You don't have to elaborate on this, but have you compared their two charts, natal charts, and is there like one specific aspect that was common to both of them?
So I do have an article on my website about this, if
Oh,
anyone's
cool.
interested.
Yep.
And so, we were talking with, I think, whose question was it? Maybe Elaine's, that there are these moments in history where things have a kind of archetypal potency. I mean, there's always an archetypal dynamic that's present, but sometimes it can be very dramatic, like the 60s or like the turn of the 20th century. And so the world transit that was in alignment, let me put on my archetypal astrologer hat for a moment, was a Uranus-Neptune opposition that lasted from 1899 to 1918. These are two very slow-moving outer planets, and the archetype, the planetary archetype, which is a term Jung coined, planetary archetype, associated with the planet Neptune, relates to imagination and spirituality and the transcendent and the image. It dissolves and permeates and unifies what it touches. It's symbolized by water, very merging, flowing, dissolving, image, illusion, delusion, what's real, what isn't, and so forth. And then the archetype that's associated with the planet Uranus has to do with awakening and liberation, kind of that brilliant, sudden, insightful aha moment that unleashes something, that liberates what it touches. So for the almost first 2 decades of the 20th century, exactly encompassing Jung's Red Book period, Tolkien's Book of Ishnis, these two planets are in alignment. And we can see that correlate as this kind of awakening of the imagination, this profound, transformative spiritual understanding, not just for the two of them, but kind of the whole collective. And what's interesting to note is where that alignment, that opposition was crossing each of their birth charts. For Jung, it was crossing his Sun Neptune aspect. Particularly, what's interesting though is his Sun, that sense of identity, kind of the heroic individual. And here Jung is this heroic individual descending into the world of archetypes in his confrontation with the unconscious. And everything's oriented around the self, that kind of spiralic, mandalic journey, which is even kind of symbolized by the glyph of the sun. That's his experience. Tolkien's, that Uranus-Neptune opposition was crossing his Venus, which is the principle of art, of beauty, of poetry. The very first poem he ever wrote of Middle Earth in 1914 is called The Voyage of Erendil, the Evening Star, Venus. And so Jung takes the experience and puts it into psychology, and the study of the individual. Tolkien creates art and poetry. Such an interesting that we can see so many of the differences right there.
That's really cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for indulging me unpacking that. Thank you, Peter. Anne, let's go to you next.
I'm not a dance historian, but I believe 1913 was when the Rite of Spring was created and caused such an uproar. There was a revolt in the theater in, I believe in England, where they tore.
I think it was Paris, right?
Was it Paris? Yes, that's quite possible. My husband was a dance historian. I'm not. We were both dancers. But I'm remembering that ballet with Nijinsky and Nijinsky's music and I'm sorry, Nijinsky's choreography, been a long, and Stravinsky's music, and how radical that was, and that the theme there was based on a revival of the earth and old rituals, and a woman chosen to dance herself to death, and that there was an amazing restaging of that by the Joffrey Ballet, and I think a film may be available of that. I was in the dance faculty at the University of Maryland at that time, and we were able to get some of the people in who were doing the restaging. So they really took us through the restaging based on leftover drawings that they found, and it was really quite a chore to put that together. But so much.
It was 1913, just to confirm that. Yeah, it was May of 1913.
Oh, you're more on top of that than I am.
Well, this is a fun synchronicity actually, because I opened one of the classes I was teaching this week. I decided not to play Rite of Spring because I thought it would be too dramatic for the moment, but I played the Firebird. So Stravinsky has been on my mind this week as well.
Do you know if there has been any writing to link what was going on across Tolkien, Jung, and the dance world there? It's just the dance, the visual art, and the music world. And tremendous changes going on during that Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. Ballet Russe, not de Monte Carlo, that came later, Ballet Russe era.
Well, I do know that what I was just talking about a moment ago in terms of that Uranus-Neptune alignment, that if you read Rick Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche, he explores that period and what was unfolding during that time all across the arts, including dance, including literature and visual painting and so forth. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Anne. I love that you brought that up. And that was a nice little synchronicity for me with Stravinsky.
Yeah.
All right, Ulrich, I imagine you're going to bring us to a close as you started us off.
Yes, I wish that I could maybe participate, but we're getting close to the end here. I do want to thank you. This was a brilliant, erudite, beautiful presentation. Your concluding remarks were nothing short of poetry and sublime. Thank you. I want to thank you on behalf of the Jung Association of Western Massachusetts and all the folks that joined us tonight. Thank you to all the folks that joined us. Um, I would speak more, but we are at the end of it. I think there's a great deal. I've got maybe 3 minutes, so I'm going to say what strikes me about Tolkien's work particularly, and I've been, as you were, familiar with it from a very young age. But more recently, some of the symbols in it have come forward for me. For example, the Palantir. Think of how it's described. You look into this seeing stone, and you see images of your past, your present, and your future. And while you're looking into it, the Dark Lord is getting information about you, personal information about you, and it's very dangerous. And it's such an important the wisdom that has been transferred in these myths are so important for this time we're living in. The ring of power is as a ring of invisibility. It means that someone is in the room with you and knows what's going on, but you don't see them. That is the ultimate power. And in the story, it talks about how corrupting that power is. It's a wonderful work. And I just want to, I just threw that out, but I want to just thank you again for bringing all this. I hope you'll come back and speak with us again.
Oh, thank you so much. It really was such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you for all your insightful comments and questions. And I really am so grateful for the gift of your attention this evening.